Stop. Stop scrolling. Stop whatever you were about to do in the next 10 seconds. Because what I am about to tell you is one of the most quietly devastating details ever revealed about the final years of Queen Elizabeth II, and almost nobody has fully understood what it actually means. Picture this: an elderly woman, the longest reigning monarch in British history, more than 70 years on the throne. A woman who had stared down world wars, constitutional crises, the abdication that reshaped her childhood, the so-called annus horribilis of the 1990s, and decades of family turbulence without ever once letting the public see her flinch. And in the last years of her life, that woman, that monarch, would not get on the telephone with her own grandson unless another person was physically standing in the room with her. Read that again. Let it land. The Queen of the United Kingdom would not take a private phone call from Prince Harry alone. She asked her lady-in-waiting to stay with her every single time. And as what one palace source has described as moral support and as protection, so that there would be a record of what was actually said. That is not a tabloid rumor. That is not an anonymous whisper from a disgruntled former footman. That detail comes directly from the pages of a brand new, meticulously researched 672-page biography written by Hugo Vickers, a royal historian the Financial Times has now described as the most knowledgeable royal biographer on the planet. The book is called Queen Elizabeth II: A Personal History. It is built on 60 years of research, on more than 40 personal meetings with the late Queen herself, and on a lifetime of connections inside the royal household that almost no other writer alive can match. And now, I am going to walk you through everything this book reveals: the witness in the room, the breakdown of trust, the Queen's own private, cutting words about what her grandson had really chosen, the truth about her mental sharpness right up to the final hours, against the journalists now trying to suggest otherwise, the reason Prince Philip, of all people, came within a hair of suing Netflix, and the portrait, drawn by a man who knew her, of who Elizabeth II actually was when the cameras were switched off. But before we go any further, let me make sure you understand exactly who Hugo Vickers is, because the credibility of the messenger is the whole story here. Vickers is not a celebrity gossip writer. He is not a social media commentator chasing a viral clip. He is a royal historian and biographer with a career stretching back across decades, the author of acclaimed lives of the Queen Mother, of Princess Andrew of Greece, who was Prince Philip's mother, of Cecil Beaton, and of a long shelf of other serious works. He is a man so embedded in the actual fabric of royal life that he serves as a verger at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the very chapel where royal weddings and royal funerals take place. He has been present at events like the installation of Knights of the Garter. He has moved quietly and respectably through the real world of the British establishment for his entire adult life. When a man like that publishes a 672-page biography, every claim inside it has been weighed, checked, and considered. This is not a man who throws words around. This is a man who chooses them with enormous care. And that care is precisely why this book lands so hard, because Hugo Vickers is, by temperament and by necessity, cautious. A historian in his position has connections that depend on discretion. He cannot simply say whatever he likes. He has to be measured. So when even a man as careful as Hugo Vickers puts something as striking as the lady-in-waiting detail into print, you should understand that he is telling you he is certain. The caution is the credential. The restraint is the proof. So get comfortable, settle in, because this is not gossip. This is history, told by one of the few people genuinely qualified to tell it. And by the time we are finished, you will understand the late Queen and the rupture inside her family in a way you simply did not before. Let me start with the claim that frames this entire story. The claim that, for years, was treated as the territory of conspiracy theorists and dismissed as the imaginings of people who had lost their grip. For years, there has been a persistent suspicion that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were gathering material on the royal family, recording, documenting, collecting. It is worth being careful and precise here, because this matters. Nobody has produced a signed confession, but it was reported at the time by senior figures in the British press that one of the reasons Meghan Markle was not, in the end, placed on a speakerphone during the Sandringham Summit in January of 2020, the summit where the terms of the Sussex departure were thrashed out, was a concern within the family about exactly that. A concern about what might be recorded, a concern about what might one day resurface in a commercial project. And here is the thing. At the time, that reporting was widely mocked. The people who suggested it were painted as fantasists, as obsessives, as bitter cranks who could not accept that a young couple simply wanted a quieter life. The royal press pack, for the most part, would not touch it. It was treated as beneath serious journalism, and yet look at what the years since have actually delivered. Look at the Netflix series, where the couple openly displayed private text messages and personal communications on screen for a global audience. Look at the memoir, which laid out private family conversations in extraordinary, granular detail. Look at the broadcast interview that turned intimate royal exchanges into prime-time television. The pattern that the so-called conspiracy theorists described was not a fantasy. It was, with hindsight, simply an accurate early reading of how this couple would operate once the cameras and the contracts arrived. The mockers were wrong. The people raising the alarm were uncomfortably right. And then look at what followed. Look at the Netflix series itself, where the couple openly showed text messages and private communications, where moments that were once considered sacrosanct family business became streaming content for a global audience. The idea that the family worried about being documented was never a wild fantasy. It was, frankly, a reasonable read of the people they were dealing with. But here is why the Hugo Vickers book changes the conversation entirely. Because now, in black and white, in a serious historian's published account, we have the late Queen herself behaving in a way that tells you everything. Vickers writes, and I am quoting the book directly, "Whenever Prince Harry called his grandmother, she asked her lady-in-waiting to stay with her," end quote. And a palace source, speaking about those same conversations, described the Queen's side of them as restrained almost to the point of silence. "Lots of one-word answers," the source said. "Yes" and "no." That is it. That is what those phone calls between a grandmother and her grandson had been reduced to. One-word answers delivered carefully, with a witness sitting nearby. Now think about what that actually means. This is a woman who, by every account, adored Harry, who had a genuine, deep, lifelong soft spot for him. The grandson who made her laugh. The grandson who had served his country in uniform. And by the end, she could not speak to him on the telephone without a chaperone present to record what was said. Hugo Vickers puts it plainly. The distress the Sussexes caused the Queen in the last years of her life, he writes, cannot be overestimated. This is the part most people get wrong. They read that detail and they think, how sad, how cold. And yes, it is sad, but look closer and you see something else entirely. You see a monarch being eminently, ruthlessly sensible. Because how do you protect yourself from a situation where a private remark might be taken out of context, reframed, repackaged, and broadcast to the world? You make sure you are never the only witness to your own words. That is not paranoia. That is the hard-earned caution of a woman who had spent 70 years learning exactly how private royal moments can be turned into public ammunition. And here is something even more striking. The caution did not stop at phone calls. According to the Vickers book, even the in-person interactions were managed with the same careful, deliberate hand. When Harry and Meghan brought their daughter to meet the Queen at Windsor Castle in June of 2022, a lady-in-waiting was once again present in the room. And the Queen declined the request for a professional photographer to capture the moment. Think about that. A great-grandmother meeting a great-grandchild. One of the most natural, joyful occasions in any family on earth. And the late monarch, with all her experience, decided that no photographer would be there. Why? Because of concern about how such images might later be used. Because of concern about leaks. Because she had learned the hardest possible way that nothing involving the Sussexes stayed private for long. Here is where it gets even more revealing, because Vickers does not just document the Queen's caution, he documents her private opinion, and her private opinion was sharp. According to the book, the Queen once remarked to a friend about Harry's new life in California, and I am quoting, "And now Harry has opted out, and for what? To be a carer for Archie?" End quote. Sit with the weight of that sentence. To be a carer for Archie, that is not the language of a confused or sentimental old woman. That is the language of a monarch who had given her entire life, every single day of it, to duty, looking across the Atlantic at a grandson who had walked away from that same duty, and quietly, privately, devastatingly questioning what exactly he had walked away for. And this was not a sudden judgment formed at the end. The reservations ran right back to the beginning. Vickers reveals that before the wedding, the Queen herself advised Harry to wait a year before marrying. King Charles, then the Prince of Wales, reportedly urged caution of his own. And Prince Philip, in his blunt, no-nonsense way, simply referred to Meghan as the American. The family, according to this account, had its hesitations from the very start. The Queen suggested a delay. Harry did not take the advice. The wedding went ahead just over 6 months after the engagement was announced. Now, I want to be fair and balanced here because that is what serious analysis requires. When approached for comment on this book, Buckingham Palace took the position it almost always takes, which is that it does not comment on such books. And a spokesperson for the Sussexes office indicated this was not something they would comment on either. So the couple have not given their side, and you are entitled to weigh that silence however you choose. But the source here is not an anonymous troll. The source is a 60-year royal historian with more than 40 personal meetings with the late Queen behind him. That is about as authoritative as royal history ever gets. So why did the trust break down so completely? Hugo Vickers, in conversation, has been characteristically cautious about it. He has suggested the Queen was, in his words, feeling rather cautious whenever Harry got in touch. That is the courtly, diplomatic way of putting it. But read between the lines, the way you always have to read between the lines with a historian, this careful, and the message is unmistakable. The problem was not simply Harry. The problem by this stage was that Harry had a proactive wife with an agenda of her own. The family, by this account, did not trust the situation. And once trust is gone at that level, the lady-in-waiting in the room is not cruelty, it is just common sense. And it is worth pausing here to note that the Queen was not alone in this caution. According to reporting at the time, a similar arrangement had taken hold higher up the family too. The then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, and Prince William had reportedly reached a decision that they would not meet Harry one-on-one either. The thinking, by that account, was the same thinking that guided the Queen. There needed to be a witness in the room. Someone who could, if necessary, confirm what had genuinely been said, and confirm it against any version that might later be presented differently in public. Now, to be balanced about it, courtiers and private secretaries are often present at royal meetings as a simple matter of routine. Vickers himself makes that point. When he interviewed the then Prince Charles for an earlier book, a press secretary sat alongside them. That is normal. But the specific, deliberate decision to never be alone with one particular family member, that is not routine. That is a signal. And it is a signal that, by the final years, ran right through the senior ranks of the family. There is one more layer to this that the public should sit with honestly. Think about how, in the Sussexes' own Netflix series, private family communications were placed directly on screen, text messages, screenshots, moments that, in any other family, would never leave the room. I am not telling you that proves any single specific claim. I am telling you that the family's caution did not come from nowhere. It came from a pattern they had watched unfold in real time. When you have seen private material become public content once, you do not need to be paranoid to be careful the next time. You only need to be sensible. And whatever else the late Queen was, she was always, always sensible. But here is the part I find genuinely fascinating, and it is a point Hugo Vickers draws out beautifully. The Queen's whole life was a balancing act between two roles that were sometimes in direct conflict. She was a grandmother, she was a mother, she was a sister, and she was also the head of state. Those two things did not always point in the same direction. Vickers describes how, when something difficult was placed on her desk, the Queen would sometimes ask, not what should I do, but what should the Queen do? What should the Queen do? She understood better than anyone who has ever held that office that the woman and the institution were not the same thing, and that when they collided, the institution had to win. That is the lens through which she handled the Harry situation, not as a wounded grandmother lashing out, as a head of state protecting the office. Now, let me turn to something the book addresses that I think is enormously important, because there has been an active attempt right now to rewrite the story of the Queen's final days. There is a journalist, Andrew Lowney, who has done some genuinely notable reporting over the years, and who in his recent work has tried to suggest that the late Queen was, in some sense, losing her mental sharpness toward the end of her reign. That claim deserves to be addressed head-on because Hugo Vickers addresses it and because the evidence simply does not support it. Consider Liz Truss. And Liz Truss matters here for one very specific reason. She is one of the last public officials on Earth to have spent a substantial, formal period of time with Queen Elizabeth II before her death. She was appointed Prime Minister by the Queen at Balmoral just 2 days before the Queen passed away. And Liz Truss has been absolutely insistent in her public account of that meeting. The Queen, she has said, was completely compos mentis. Her mind during that entire meeting was sharp. Yes, the physical decline was visible. The Queen was frail. But mentally, there was no decline. None. And Hugo Vickers reaches the very same conclusion. There is a detail he recounts that, on its own, all but settles the question. On the very last full evening of her life, the Queen had been carrying out one of the most demanding duties any monarch performs. She had received 2 prime ministers in a single morning. The outgoing Boris Johnson and the incoming Liz Truss. In that evening, when her racing manager telephoned her, the Queen said to him, and the line is now well documented, "I have had revolving doors with prime ministers all morning. I have had revolving doors with prime ministers all morning." Stop and appreciate that line. That is wit, that is timing. That is a woman fully, completely present, making a dry joke about the constitutional churn she had just personally overseen. That is not somebody who has lost her grip. Vickers, who saw her himself in June of 2022 and spent 15 minutes with her, described her as bright as a button. She heard everything. She saw everything. She responded to everything. She had what he called a wonderful random access to facts. You could never catch her out, he said. She liked catching you out. So when a journalist now suggests the Queen was fading mentally, Vickers is blunt about it. He says, in effect, that this particular journalist is making things up because it suits him to do so. And he points out that the same writer has gone on to suggest the king should abdicate. In other words, the man has an agenda. The eyewitness testimony from Liz Truss, from the racing manager, from Vickers himself, from her equerry, Charles Richards, who said goodnight to her on that final evening and described her thanking him with a smile before she went upstairs. All of it points the same way. The Queen was sharp, engaged, and in command, right to the very end. She simply went up to bed, did not feel well the next morning, and did not come back down. There was no long mental decline. There is no honest version of events in which there was, and there is a wider point worth making here, because this is exactly how history gets quietly rewritten. A claim is floated. It is dramatic. It travels well. It gets repeated, and with each repetition, it hardens into something people simply assume is true. The suggestion that the Queen was not herself at the end is precisely that kind of claim. It is sticky. It is the sort of thing that 20 years from now could end up in a textbook if nobody pushes back on it now. And that is why the testimony of the actual eyewitnesses matters so enormously. Liz Truss did not read about the Queen's final days in a newspaper. She was in the room. She was appointed by the Queen, in person at Balmoral, 48 hours before the end. Her account is not interpretation, it is observation, and it should carry far more weight than the theory of a writer who was not there and who, by Vickers' reckoning, has a separate agenda to push. When the people who were physically present all describe a sharp, witty, fully engaged monarch, and the person who was not present describes a decline, you do not need to be a historian to work out which version to trust. And while we are here, let me address the question of abdication directly, because Vickers does, and the answer is important. Could the Queen have abdicated? In Vickers' view, no, not really. She was an anointed queen. That anointing, that sacred element of the coronation, meant that abdication was something she felt she genuinely could not do, even had she ever wanted to, which she did not. And remember the family history. It was her uncle Edward VIII whose abdication threw the throne onto the shoulders of her father, a man who had never expected or wanted it, and then in time onto her own. Abdication was not a neutral word in that family. It was a wound. The Queen was not pleased when Queen Juliana of the Netherlands stepped down, nor later when Queen Beatrix did the same. And in any case, Vickers makes the constitutional point clearly. A British monarch does not have to abdicate to step back. If a sovereign cannot perform their duties, a regency can be appointed, exactly as happened with George III and the future George IV, who served as Prince Regent for nearly a decade. The Queen never needed it. She carried the load herself to the finish. It is worth dwelling on that distinction for a moment, because it is one of the most misunderstood facts about the British crown. People assume that an aging or unwell monarch faces a simple binary, soldier on or abdicate. That is not true, and the Queen knew it was not true better than anyone. The regency mechanism exists precisely so that the institution can continue smoothly, even when the individual cannot. George III spent the final stretch of his long reign unwell, and the machinery of monarchy carried on around him through his son as Prince Regent, an era so distinctive it gave its name to an entire period of British architecture, fashion, and literature. So the Queen always had that option in reserve. She never came close to needing it. By every account we have just examined, she was discharging her constitutional duties, receiving prime ministers, reading her papers, and exercising her famous memory right up to the last 48 hours of her life. The one engagement she did quietly stand down, a Privy Council meeting conducted by video link on her final evening, was the gentlest possible signal that the body was tiring. The mind, by every witness account, was not. And then she simply went upstairs. Now let me turn to one of the most jaw-dropping revelations in this entire book. And the timing of it is perfect, because Netflix is bringing the drama The Crown back, this time to explore the earlier years, the young Princess Elizabeth and her relationship with Prince Philip. Hugo Vickers reveals that Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, was so deeply affected by something in The Crown that he came genuinely close to taking legal action against Netflix. And here is the part that surprises everyone. It was not the affair rumors. It was not the salacious marital speculation the series so often hinted at. Philip, a man who had endured a lifetime of that sort of gossip, could let that wash over him. What he could not let go was the way the producers handled one of the most traumatic events of his entire life. Let me tell you the real story first, because you have to understand the truth to understand the offense. In 1937, Prince Philip's beloved sister, Cecily, was traveling to a family wedding. Her aircraft hit a factory chimney in heavy fog. It crashed. Cecily was killed. So was her husband. So was her husband's mother. So were her 2 young sons. And she was pregnant. Her unborn child was born and died in that same accident, along with several other people. It was an annihilation of a family in a single moment. Philip was a teenage boy at school. He was called into his headmaster's study and told that his sister was dead. By the account of his own archivist, the worst thing that ever happened to Prince Philip in his entire life was that moment, and he minded all the more because she was carrying a child. Now here is what The Crown did with that real tragedy, according to Vickers. The series, which Vickers describes as lavishly produced, well acted, well-scripted and yet fundamentally dishonest in the way it fuses separate events together to manufacture drama that never happened, took that plane crash and built a fiction around it. In the dramatized version, there is a brawl at school. Philip punches another boy. As punishment, his half-term is canceled. Because his half-term is canceled, he does not travel to Darmstadt. And then the series stages a scene at Cecily's funeral in which Philip's own father turns to him and says, in effect, "It is because of you, boy, that I am burying my favorite child. It is because of you that I am burying my favorite child," to a grieving teenager about the death of his sister. And none of it was true. There was no brawl. There was no canceled half-term. Philip would not have been traveling to Darmstadt regardless. His sister was coming to England for a family wedding. And the real account of the funeral is the precise opposite of the cruelty the drama invented. Prince Philip's father was in London at the time, and he personally collected his son from Gordonstown and took him to the funeral together. Father and son traveling to bury Cecily, side by side. To take that and twist it into a scene where a father blames a child for his sister's death was, in Vickers' words, outrageous, unkind, cruel, and deeply shocking. And here is the human detail that I find genuinely moving. Hugo Vickers went on the Today program on BBC Radio 4 one morning, and when asked what he particularly disliked about The Crown, he told that exact story. He set the record straight on air, and Prince Philip, as it happened, was listening that morning at Sandringham. Vickers knows for a fact that Philip had already been to see his lawyer about the matter. It is very difficult, legally, to sue over one element of a production and not others. But Philip felt that the record had, at least in part, been publicly corrected, and so he let the legal action drop. He was not happy about it. Vickers is absolutely clear on that point, but the truth had been spoken aloud, and that mattered to him. And this brings me to the portrait of Prince Philip that emerges from this book, because it is a portrait of a man Hugo Vickers believes is still, even now, deeply underrated. This was a man with a formidable brain, a man who loved to argue a point, not for the sake of conflict, but because he believed that by arguing you arrive at a consensus, you sharpen an opinion. A man with what Vickers calls a naval mind, strategic, precise, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always asking what happens next. A man who worked tirelessly behind the scenes on countless projects, the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme among them, who knew exactly when the Queen needed him at her side for a state visit or a state opening of Parliament, and who knew when to step back and let her stand alone. Vickers tells a small story that captures Philip's whole character. Philip's cousin, Crown Prince Pavlos of Greece, once explained that when Prince Philip greeted you with the words, "What the devil are you doing here?" that was, in fact, Philip's way of saying how extremely nice it is to see you. Once you understood that about him, Vickers says, you had him in the frame. The gruffness was not coldness. It was a kind of code, a shorthand from a man who had no patience for empty pleasantries and a great deal of warmth hidden just beneath the bark. And Vickers is clear about the scale of what Philip actually achieved. He worked away, year after year, on the Duke of Edinburgh's award, on international wildlife and conservation work, on scientific and academic conferences, on a vast hidden portfolio of causes that the public barely registered because Philip never sought the credit. Vickers expresses a genuine hope that one day a historian will be given full access to Prince Philip's papers, because when that happens, he believes the world will finally see the true extent of what the man accomplished and will be astonished by it. And here is the story that tells you who Philip really was. When Diana, Princess of Wales, died, and her 2 young sons did not want to walk behind her coffin in the funeral procession, understandably, after everything that had surrounded their mother and the press, it was Prince Philip who found the words. He said to them the night before, "Look, when you are older, you would very much regret it if you did not walk in your mother's funeral procession." And then he said the thing that mattered most, "And I will walk with you." And he did. That was Prince Philip taking the long view. That was the strategic mind turned toward kindness. He could see decades ahead, what those boys would need, and he made sure he was beside them when they needed it. It is one of the most quietly moving acts in the entire modern history of the royal family, and it was done without fanfare, without a press release, without a single thought of how it might look. It was simply a grandfather doing the right thing for two grieving boys. Vickers also reveals that Philip worked far harder than the public ever knew to hold the Wales marriage together. After the Morton book detonated, Philip wrote a series of letters to Diana, and she wrote back, and Vickers has actually seen that correspondence. He describes the letters as genuinely revealing, the letters of a man doing his level best to keep a marriage from collapsing. He wrote to Sarah Ferguson too, although those letters by all accounts were rather sharper and are kept in a bank somewhere, and we will almost certainly never read them. Philip's verdict on the Duchess of York was that she was irresponsible, and his comment when Prince Andrew became engaged to her tells you everything in just 3 words. Well, he chose her. He chose her. That is the whole judgment, delivered with surgical economy. So let me bring this all together, because the picture that emerges from Hugo Vickers' book is the picture of a queen the public never fully saw. What was Queen Elizabeth II actually like, away from the cameras, from the testimony of one of the very few writers who genuinely spent time with her across the decades? She was not a philosopher. She did not deal in grand abstractions. She dealt in facts, and she had an extraordinary, almost supernatural memory for them. Vickers tells a story that captures it perfectly. At a reception at Windsor Great Park, the conversation turned to a Maori chief in New Zealand who was refusing to meet Prince William over a scheduling issue. And the Queen instantly, without missing a beat, recalled that back in 1953, on her own visit to New Zealand, the Prime Minister of the day had tried to stop her meeting the predecessor of that very same Maori clan. And then she added a detail nobody had raised, that the chief in question was, in everyday life, a bus driver. How did she know that? It was not on any agenda. It had not come up. She simply knew. That, Vickers argues, is perhaps the single greatest gift a constitutional monarch can possess. A memory so deep that when a prime minister arrives with a problem, the Queen could say, in 1961, something very similar happened. You might consider looking at what we did then. He did not have to take her advice, but he would be wise to listen. She had a wonderful sense of humor and a superb sense of timing. One of her favorite questions, delivered to anyone who made a confident claim in front of her, was simply, "Are you sure?" And you had better be, because she would almost always be better informed than you were. Privately, by Vickers' account, she was a gifted mimic, said to do a quite uncanny impression of her uncle, the Duke of Windsor, with his faintly transatlantic accent. But in public, she had learned a lesson that very few people in modern life ever learn. She had learned that she had more to gain by saying nothing than by saying something. Vickers points to her favorite line from the Bible, from the Gospel of Luke. Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. She took everything in. She simply did not feel the need to comment on it. And so we never really knew what she was thinking. That, Vickers says, was a tremendous asset. There is a story Vickers tells about the very beginning of the reign that I think captures the steel underneath the warmth. When the household returned from the lying-in state of her father, King George VI, at Westminster Hall, the novelist Daphne du Maurier was there. Du Maurier was married to the man then running the new queen's office. The young queen sent for him. He went up to see her, and afterwards du Maurier asked the obvious question. Was the queen distraught? Was she in a terrible state, having just buried her father and inherited the weight of the crown in a single stroke? And the answer was no, not a bit of it. The young queen simply wanted to check the court circular, the official record of royal engagements, and to make sure it was going to be issued correctly. Du Maurier's verdict on hearing that was immediate. "Do not get me wrong," she said. "This is going to be the most fantastic reign. We are in really good hands." And she was right. That quiet, practical, unshakable focus on getting the detail correct, even in the middle of personal grief, was the quality that would define 7 decades on the throne. And in her later years, she softened just a little. After she turned 80, she allowed herself a few small pleasures. She went to the Kentucky Derby on an American visit, reasoning, in effect, that if you have not done a thing by the time you are 80, you never will. She took a boat and brought her grandchildren on a cruise around the Western Isles of Scotland, because by then the Royal Yacht Britannia was gone, and she found another way to do it. Little things done for her own quiet enjoyment after a lifetime in which the answer was always, always duty first.